Alrighty, in this lesson we're going to be talking about loops, specifically for loops. Now, in most programming languages, there are two types of loops, or two categories, rather. There are for loops, spelled like the word for, and then there are while loops, spelled like the word while. In this lesson, we're just covering for loops. So we've already experienced for loops when we loop through an array. And just to give you a little bit of a refresher, let's write an array 1, 2, 3. That's our array, and to loop through it, we say for variable index in ARR. Now the reason we do the var index is because, well, this index is going to be 0, 1, 2, but that var means that the index is going to stay local to our for loop. So now when we write console.log index, and let's also log the array with the index rather, save that, and refresh our page, we get 0, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. So that's a basic for loop. That's how you loop through an array. You can loop through objects as well. You cannot loop through strings or numbers, but you can split them and then loop through whatever pieces are in that array. So what I want to talk about today is the different type of for loop, not the one that loops through arrays or objects, but the one that loops based on whatever you tell it to loop through. As an example, it looks like this: for variable I is equal to 0, so you set your variable, this is your local variable that's only going to apply inside the curly brackets for your for loop, semicolon, I is less than or equal to 10, for example, so this is your comparison, semicolon, and then after each loop, just increment variable I by 1. Now we can change all of these. I doesn't have to equal 0. I can run until this is, 1,000 if you wanted it to, really. For this purpose, that's a little overkill. And then if you wanted to increment by 10 or 5 or 4.2, you could do that. So now when we console log I, or index, save that, we refresh our page, there we have 0 to 10. So essentially at the end of every one of these loops, what it's saying is I++, that matches this right here, the same thing as that. Variable I is equal to 0. And whatever is in here, whoops, let's make that highlightable. So whatever is in this section is going to run over and over and over again until this little I reaches the number 10. Well, technically till it reaches number 11, because it's going to run as long as this number is less than or equal to the number 10. So that is a basic for loop. Now, you might be thinking, when the heck am I going to use that? Well, let's write an example. Variable sentence is equal to the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. Now, what if we want to break this apart? Well, we know that we can use sentence.split. And if we specify, get in there, and we specify that the split has to split each word, we just use a space, right? And that's not what we want to do. We could do that, and we could iterate, we could loop over each word, but that's not what we want to do. Instead, let's do this. For variable I is equal to 0, because computers start counting at 0. I is less than or equal to sentence.length, because we know how long the string is going to be. Well, I mean, we don't physically know it, but JavaScript knows it. And then after each iteration, I++. Let's see what happens when we try this. Console.log sentence, and in our array brackets, we put the index number. Save that. Refresh. Would you look at that? So our string can be accessed as an array. Isn't that weird? And so for every letter, including spaces, anything in there, what it's going to do is it's going to iterate over and over and over again, and it's going to die at the end. It's going to, die might be a little bit of a brutal word, but it's going to stop running. So essentially, loops run until they don't. Now what if we only wanted to get every second or third letter? Well, we can apply some logic in here. If I modulus 2 is equal to 0, let's see what this does. Then console log sentence with the index. And now it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And that's because we're filtering out now. We're saying that if the modulus of I, the remainder, is ever equal to 0, then only show us what that letter is going to be. Now let's go ahead and change the sentence because I want to count all of the letters in a particular sentence. Rather, I want to count all of the particular letters in a particular sentence. So, hello world, my name is Otto, I guess. I swim in a pool. So we know there are a lot of letter O's in here, but we want to know just how many there are. Now, if this was user input, we wouldn't know what they're inputting. So how do we go ahead and count how many letters are in there? How many of the letter O is in there, rather? So our loop still holds. We're going to loop through every letter in here, and we can say this, variable letter is equal to sentence I, a little bit redundant at this point because sentence I is not really complex. However, it does add a level of clarity. Just going to get rid of that. And you know what? In fact, let's do this. 2 lowercase. This makes our if statement a little bit easier, and you'll see why in a sec. If letter is equal to, oh, that's 0, O, then we're going to say number plus plus. That's not defined yet. And we're going to say in here, var number is equal to 0. Now, number is the number of O's in a sentence. So now we're getting a little more complex with our loop. So now we have a variable outside of our for loop, which is also incrementing, but only increments whenever it finds the letter O. Even if it's a capital O, it's going to change it to a lowercase o and try to match that. Now the reason we didn't declare number inside of our loop is because if we declare number is equal to 0 right in here, well, every time we iterate over this loop, it's going to reset that number back to 0, and that number is never going to get anywhere. The furthest it could possibly get is to 1, and then the loop ends, and that's only if the last letter ends in an O. Now that's definitely not what we want. So let's do this, and outside of our loop, console log number. Cannot read property 2 lowercase. Now why can't it do that? What happens if we just remove it? Let's see what happens. Well, that works. 2 lowercase is not working. Let's see what the error says. Cannot read property 2 lowercase of undefined. So there's obviously an undefined character in there. What we want to do is we want to wrap all of this in another if statement. If sentence I is equal to, whoops, other way around, is not equal to undefined, then try to run this. What happens? There we go. So it is now saying that we have 6 letter O's, and we can go and manually count these. We have 1, 2, 2 more in there, that's 4, 5, 6. So there we go. Now we're counting all of the exact same letter, whether it's capitalized or not. But what if we ever wanted to limit this? What if we said we should only loop through this until we find at least 3? We only want to find 3 letter O's, and then once there is 3, just stop looping. Well, what we could do is put an AND operator in here and say, and number is less than or equal to 3, or just less than 3, whatever you want it to be. But there's another way to do it. Because even though let me rewrite that. Even though it says to only run this code if number is less than 3, if this sentence is 2,000 characters long, well, I should say if this string is 2,000 characters long, that's one long run-on sentence, it's still going to run this every single time, and we don't want that to happen. Once it reaches what we tell it to reach, its maximum capacity, its maximum load, whatever we set that limit as, it needs to stop. So how do we do that? We create another if statement. If number is equal to 3, and we use this beautiful word called break, and that breaks out of a loop. So now I save this, and when I go to the page, refresh the page, it's going to say, when we console log the number, well, the number can only get to the number 3. That's as high as it can get. Because once we break, it stops the loop. And there we go, refresh the page, and we only ever get 3. Now, what if we wanted to do this with the sentence, and we could break at any point in time for any reason. Anytime we say break, the loop stops. So, not if number, if I is equal to, I don't know, somewhere in here, maybe, what would that be, 18-ish? Break, otherwise do something in here. So we could say console.log sentence I. We have hello, L shows up twice, so our console is smart enough to say, oh, there's 2 of them here. Hello world, my nad 2. So it stops at NA, stops right there, because that's the 18th letter. But now, let's look at one more example. And we're going to learn one more thing about loops here, and this is very important. We're just going to say loop, and just as an example, see how it says loop on every single iteration? What if we don't want that? So you know in a function when you use the keyword return that none of the code below it is executed. And likewise in a try-catch block, when you throw an exception, none of the code below where you've thrown that exception is executed. So in a loop, we don't return. Instead, in a loop, what we do is we continue, which means don't execute any of the code after that keyword continue. However, if there is more loop to loop through, keep going through it. And so essentially, this renders everything else here useless. So we save that, and we go back, and we should never see the word loop. Perfect. So here's an example. If the letter is an O, we're going to increment that number, so we know how many O's there are, but we don't want to display it. We want to display every other letter. So we can do an else in here, and then we can console log the letter, and now we've removed all the O's from the sentence, and on every iteration we have our own letter. So there you have it. That is a for loop. You've now been introduced to break and continue as well. In the next lesson we're going to learn about while loops. There's 2 primary while loops. Until then, what I would like you to do is create your own for loop. And I want you to practice breaking out of your for loop using the keyword break. And whenever you get the chance, try using the word continue as well and see what happens. Play around with it. Feel free to use this code. Do whatever you need to do to learn this best. If you get stuck, feel free to ask questions or use the code as reference.